Captain James Mitchell sat in the Signals Intelligence Facility at MACV headquarters in March 1968 and listened to something that made him seriously question whether he was hearing correctly. A radio transmission, apparently broadcast on an open channel, contained content that was simultaneously scandalous, embarrassing, and somehow wildly inappropriate for military communications. The transmission appeared to be between two female American military personnel. The content of the transmission was a discussion of Australian soldiers and their perceived qualities both in combat and in intimate relationships. One female voice, apparently from a nurse named Captain Lisa Morrison, stated, "The Australian soldiers are absolutely savage in combat. I have never seen anything like their intensity and their capability to sustain aggression. But in personal relationships, they are gentle and considerate. The contrast is remarkable." Another female voice, apparently from a logistics officer named Captain Susan Williams, responded, "I have observed the same thing. In operations, they are frightening, completely focused, completely aggressive. But in social situations and in relationships, they display remarkable sensitivity and consideration. The combination is extraordinary." The transmission continued for approximately 3 minutes, with the two female officers discussing Australian soldiers' apparent qualities in combat and in personal relationships. The discussion was frank and explicit in ways that military communications were definitely not supposed to be. Mitchell immediately notified his commanding officer. The commanding officer, a senior colonel named Edward Mason, listened to the recorded transmission and experienced what could only be described as shock and outrage. "This is completely inappropriate," Mason stated. "This transmission contains discussion of intimate matters on military communications channels. This transmission reveals that female military personnel are engaging in relationships with foreign military personnel and discussing those relationships on military communications. This is a security breach, a violation of military communications regulations, and evidence of conduct unbecoming an officer." Within hours, an investigation had been launched. Military investigators determined that the transmission had been broadcast accidentally. Captain Morrison and Captain Williams had apparently been conducting a private conversation via radio, believing that they were using a secure channel. They had been mistaken. The channel they were using was monitored and recorded by military signals intelligence. The transmission had been recorded and was now part of the official military record. The content of the transmission was now known to military leadership. Colonel Mason moved quickly to contain the situation. Morrison and Williams were called in for questioning. Both women initially denied that the transmission had been authentic. Both women claimed that the voices on the recording were not their voices. But voice analysis confirmed that the voices on the recording were consistent with Morrison's and Williams' voices. The denial was abandoned. Morrison and Williams were confronted with the transcript of the transmission. Both women were asked to explain the content and to acknowledge that the transmission was authentic. Morrison's response was defiant. "Yes, the transmission is authentic. Yes, I have a relationship with an Australian officer. Yes, I am willing to discuss the qualities I observe in that relationship. I have not violated any regulation. I have not compromised security. I have simply discussed my personal observations on a communications channel that I believed was secure." Williams offered a similar response. "I do not deny the transmission. I do have observations about Australian soldiers based on my interactions with them. Those observations are my professional assessment based on what I have observed. I have the right to share those observations." Colonel Mason was not satisfied with these responses.
An investigation was launched into whether Morrison and Williams had violated military regulations through their use of military communications to discuss personal matters and intimate relationships.
The investigation revealed that the regulations regarding what could be discussed on military communications channels were ambiguous. The regulations stated that military communications should be used for military purposes, but the regulations did not explicitly define what constituted a military purpose and what constituted a personal matter. This ambiguity created a situation where Morrison and Williams could argue that their discussion of Australian soldiers' military qualities was military in nature, even though the discussion had also included discussion of intimate relationships. But the broader issue was not the technical question of whether the transmission violated regulations. The broader issue was the content of the transmission and what the transmission revealed. The transmission revealed that female American military personnel were discussing Australian soldiers' intimate qualities on military communications channels. The transmission revealed that female military personnel were in relationships with Australian soldiers. The transmission revealed that female military personnel were sharing frank assessments of those relationships with other female officers. All of this was deeply problematic from the perspective of military leadership, which was already concerned about relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. Colonel Mason moved to have Morrison and Williams transferred out of Vietnam immediately.
The recommendation was approved by General Holden, the commanding general at MACV. But before the transfers could be executed, the content of the transmission had spread through the military community in Vietnam. Multiple officers had been informed of the investigation. Multiple officers were aware of what Morrison and Williams had said. By the time Morrison and Williams departed Vietnam, the transmission had become legendary. The phrase, "They are savage in battle, gentle in bed," had become shorthand for describing Australian soldiers. The phrase was repeated and quoted throughout the military. One officer made a comment that captured the situation. Morrison and Williams were fired for accidentally broadcasting the truth about Australian soldiers. The situation created a scandal that extended beyond Vietnam. When Morrison and Williams returned to the United States, their reputations had preceded them. They were known as the officers who had broadcast frank discussion of Australian soldiers' intimate qualities on military communications. The scandal attracted attention from military leadership in Washington. Questions were raised about why female military officers were being allowed to develop relationships with foreign military personnel. Questions were raised about the security implications of such relationships. Questions were raised about whether the American military's approach to managing such situations was appropriate. General Creighton Abrams, the commander of MACV, issued a memorandum addressing the situation. The memorandum stated that all military personnel should be reminded of their obligation to maintain appropriate military bearing and professional conduct at all times. The memorandum stated that military communications channels should be used exclusively for military purposes. But the memorandum did not explicitly address the relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. It did not explicitly prohibit such relationships. It simply reiterated that professional conduct was required at all times. The situation with Morrison and Williams' transmission created a precedent. It established that discussions of relationships with foreign military personnel on military communications could result in disciplinary action and reassignment. But it also revealed something that military leadership found troubling. Female officers were apparently willing to be frank about relationships with Australian soldiers. Female officers were apparently not ashamed of discussing those relationships. Female officers apparently viewed those relationships as valid and worthy of discussion. This willingness to be frank and open about relationships contradicted the implicit message that military leadership was attempting to convey. Military leadership was attempting to discourage relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers through various informal mechanisms.
But the transmission revealed that female officers were not following the implicit discouragement. Female officers were developing relationships and were willing to discuss those relationships openly. By late 1968, the transmission and the scandal it created had become part of the folklore of American military in Vietnam. The phrase, "They are savage in battle, gentle in bed," had become a running joke among military personnel. But the joke had an edge. Underneath the humor was recognition that the transmission had revealed something true. The transmission had revealed that female officers found Australian soldiers attractive, partly because of the contrast between their intensity in combat and their capability for gentleness in personal relationships. This contrast, savagery in battle, gentleness in relationships, represented something about Australian soldiers that was apparently attractive to female officers. The contrast suggested that Australian soldiers were capable of controlling their aggression and their intensity, of modulating their behavior depending on context. This capability for context-dependent behavior was apparently attractive. It suggested a kind of emotional maturity and self-control. Captain Lisa Morrison, when interviewed decades later about the transmission and the scandal it created, reflected on what she had been attempting to convey. "I was making an observation about something I had noticed," Morrison said. "Australian soldiers displayed remarkable intensity and aggression in combat. But they also displayed remarkable sensitivity and consideration in personal relationships. I found that contrast interesting and worthy of comment. I did not intend the comment to be scandalous or inappropriate. I simply intended to share what I had observed." Morrison's reflection suggested that the scandal around the transmission had partly resulted from military leadership's reaction to content that Morrison had not intended to be scandalous. Morrison had intended to make an observation about Australian soldiers' behaviour. Military leadership had interpreted the observation as inappropriate discussion of intimate matters on military communications. The Australian military, aware of the transmission through military intelligence channels, was somewhat amused by the scandal. The transmission suggested that Australian soldiers had impressed female American officers through the combination of their intensity in combat and their consideration in personal relationships. An Australian liaison officer made an observation to his American counterpart. "Your military is upset that female officers observed that Australian soldiers are both aggressive in combat and gentle in relationships. This observation seems to me to be a compliment. The observation suggests that Australian soldiers are capable of appropriate, context-dependent behaviour." The American officer had no adequate response to this observation. The Australian perspective was that the transmission represented accurate observation about Australian soldier behaviour that should be viewed positively rather than as cause for scandal. By 1969, the scandal had faded from immediate attention. Morrison and Williams had been reassigned and had moved on with their careers. But the transmission remained in the military record. The phrase, "They are savage in battle, gentle in bed," remained part of military folklore. The transmission had revealed something about how female American military officers perceived Australian soldiers. The transmission had revealed that female officers found the contrast between Australian soldiers' intensity in combat and their sensitivity in personal relationships to be attractive. This perception was based on observation of actual behaviour. Australian soldiers, trained in aggressive combat operations, did display remarkable intensity and aggression in operational contexts. Australian soldiers, when engaged in personal relationships, did display sensitivity and consideration. This context-dependent behaviour The ability to be aggressive when aggression was appropriate and gentle when gentleness was appropriate represented a kind of emotional and behavioral maturity. Female officers apparently found this maturity attractive. The transmission had revealed that assessment. By the year 2000, the transmission had become a historical artifact that was referenced in discussions of gender and the military, and of the dynamics between American and Australian military personnel in Vietnam. Military historians cited the transmission as evidence of how female officers had perceived Australian soldiers, and as evidence that female officers had been willing to express frank opinions about relationships, despite military discouragement. One military historian, Dr. Robert Patterson, cited the transmission in his comprehensive study of American-Australian military relations in Vietnam. The transmission represents a moment when implicit military culture regarding personal relationships and military discipline collided with the frank observations of female officers who refused to accept the implicit discouragement of relationships with foreign military personnel, Patterson wrote. The transmission revealed that female officers found Australian soldiers attractive, partly because of qualities displayed in both combat and personal contexts. The transmission also revealed that military leadership was willing to punish female officers for expressing frank observations about those attractions. Patterson's analysis highlighted the broader significance of the transmission beyond its immediate scandalous content. The transmission had revealed something about female officers' willingness to assert their perspective and their observations. The transmission had revealed something about military leadership's unwillingness to tolerate frank discussion of attractions to foreign military personnel. The transmission had represented a moment of conflict between female officers' assertion of their right to form opinions and relationships, and military leadership's attempt to control those opinions and relationships. Captain Susan Williams, when interviewed decades later, reflected on the significance of the transmission and the scandal it created. "We were honest about what we observed," Williams said. "We observed that Australian soldiers were impressive in both combat and personal contexts. We expressed that observation on what we thought was a secure communications channel. The military punished us for that honesty. But the honesty itself was valuable. It revealed truths about Australian soldiers and about how female officers perceived Australian soldiers. It revealed that female officers would not be silenced regarding relationships that we valued." Williams' reflections suggested that the transmission had contributed to a broader assertion by female officers of their right to form relationships and to express opinions about those relationships without military interference. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after the transmission had been broadcast, the phrase, "They are savage in battle, gentle in bed," remained recognizable to military historians and to those familiar with American military history in Vietnam. The phrase had taken on a kind of legendary status. It represented a moment when implicit military culture had collided with the frank observations of female officers. It represented a moment when military discipline had attempted to suppress honest observation about relationships and human behavior. The slouch hat remained a symbol of Australian military competence. The intercepted radio transmission remained a symbol of female officers' willingness to assert their perspective and their observations despite military discouragement. These symbols were connected. Both represented Australian influence on American military in Vietnam. The slouch hat represented Australian military effectiveness. The transmission represented the way that Australian soldiers had impressed female American officers and the way that female officers had refused to remain silent about those impressions. The transmission had scandalized military leadership, but it had also revealed something true. Australian soldiers displayed a kind of behavioral maturity in their ability to be appropriately aggressive in combat and appropriately gentle in personal relationships. This capability for context-dependent behavior was apparently attractive to female officers. The transmission had revealed that assessment despite military disapproval.
By the year 2025, the transmission remained part of military historical record. The transmission remained one of the most famous accidental radio broadcasts in military history. The transmission remained evidence of how female officers had perceived Australian soldiers and of how female officers had refused to accept military discouragement of those perceptions. The phrase, "They are savage in battle, gentle in bed," remained part of military lore. The phrase remained a reminder of a moment when female officers had asserted their right to form opinions and relationships despite military resistance. That assertion had contributed to a broader evolution in how military institutions treated female officers and how military institutions approached questions of personal relationships. The transmission had not intended to create that impact. It had simply been a private conversation that had accidentally been broadcast on an open channel. But the transmission, once revealed, had contributed to conversations about female officers' rights and military institutions' appropriate scope of authority. Those conversations had eventually resulted in changes to how military institutions approached gender relations and how military institutions treated female officers.
All of it traced back to the moment when Captain Lisa Morrison and Captain Susan Williams had discussed their observations of Australian soldiers on what they believed was a secure communications channel. The moment had been scandalous. The moment had been consequential. The slouch hat remained visible. The transmission remained invisible to most contemporary observers. But both had shaped how American military evolved in response to the Australian presence in Vietnam.